He didn't move to the mountains to be a hero. He moved there to disappear. But one frozen morning, a former soldier and his aging German shepherd found tire tracks where no vehicle should exist, and silence that felt wrong. What they uncovered beneath the snow wasn't just poaching. It was a secret powerful people would kill to protect. And when they realized he was watching, the mountain became a line no one was allowed to cross. What happens next will make you believe in quiet miracles and second chances for the forgotten. Before we begin, tell me where you are watching from. Drop your country in the comments below. If you believe no child or animal should ever face fear alone, hit subscribe now and share this story with someone who needs hope. Winter in the Bitterroot Valley did not announce itself. It settled in slowly, layer by layer, until the land moved under its rules alone. The sky that morning was a dull steel gray, hanging low over western Montana, pressing down on the mountains as if testing their resolve. Snow lay thick across the valley floor, packed hard by weeks of wind and cold. Pine forests rose dark and dense along the slopes, their branches heavy, unmoving. The air carried no scent of softness, only frozen earth, resin, and the faint bite of coming weather. In a place like this, the cold was not dramatic. It was constant, practical, and unforgiving. Ethan Crowley preferred it that way. He drove past the last paved road just after dawn, tires crunching steadily over compacted snow. The town of Hamilton disappeared behind him without ceremony. No skyline, no traffic noise, just a gradual thinning of buildings until only fence posts and tree lines remained. Ethan did not look back. He never did. He was 39 years old, built solid from years of physical labor and military service, his strength functional rather than showy. His face was weathered but controlled, with sharp cheekbones, a square jaw, and a short, uneven scar near the corner of his mouth, an old injury that had healed cleanly but never fully faded. His hair was dark, kept short out of habit, and his beard shadow was permanent despite regular shaving. His eyes were hazel, steady and observant, the kind that missed very little even when he appeared relaxed. He drove with both hands on the wheel, posture upright, movements economical. The habits of 20 years as a reconnaissance marksman had not left him. They had simply gone quiet. In the back seat, secured by a reinforced harness, sat Ranger. The German shepherd was large even by breed standards, broad through the chest and shoulders, his frame dense with muscle earned rather than bred for appearance. His coat was thick and well kept, black along the saddle, and muzzle, tan along the legs and chest. One ear stood erect, the other bore a permanent notch, the result of shrapnel from a deployment years earlier. His gait carried a slight stiffness in the cold, but his alertness was undiminished. Ranger's eyes, deep amber brown, tracked the world continuously through the rear window, reflecting intelligence rather than excitement. He was calm, disciplined, and deeply bonded to the man in the driver's seat. Ranger had once been a military working dog, trained for tracking and perimeter defense. After an injury ended his service, he had been quietly retired, too valuable to discard but no longer useful to the institution that shaped him. Ethan had adopted him without ceremony. They recognized something familiar in each other, a usefulness that had outlived its original purpose. 6 months earlier, Ethan had purchased 2,000 acres of mountain land at the upper edge of the valley, steep forest, narrow drainages, exposed granite, and a protected watershed cutting through the eastern section. The property had belonged to an elderly rancher named Silas Hargrove, who died without close heirs. The land was sold through an estate firm in Missoula, sight unseen. The price had been lower than expected, the paperwork clean. Ethan had not questioned it. He wanted distance, not explanations. The cabin he built sat high above the valley floor, positioned for visibility rather than comfort. It was a simple structure, thick log walls, a metal roof, reinforced shutters, and a generator housed in a separate shed. Everything about the place was deliberate. He relied on wood heat, stored fuel, and redundancy. He had installed discrete motion cameras along known game corridors, not out of paranoia, but because awareness was a form of respect for the land and for himself. That morning, Ethan slowed as he approached the final stretch of road. The steel gate marking the boundary of his property stood exactly as he had left it. Locked, chained, untouched, he parked, cut the engine, and stepped out into the cold. Ranger followed, landing lightly in the snow and immediately scanning the tree line. Ethan checked the gate first. The lock was intact. No scratches, no bent links. He walked the fence line briefly, more out of habit than concern. Everything appeared normal. Then he saw the tracks. They cut across the snow at an angle, entering his property several yards from the gate. The impressions were deep and wide, left by a heavy vehicle. Ethan crouched and examined them closely. The tread pattern was aggressive and unfamiliar, industrial rather than recreational. This was not a ranch truck or a snowmobile. The weight distribution suggested a fully loaded vehicle moving with confidence. He followed the tracks with his eyes as they moved deeper into the trees, and stopped. Exactly 50 yards in, the tire marks ended. There was no turn, no gradual fade, no churned snow where a vehicle might have reversed or maneuvered. The ground beyond was untouched, smooth as if nothing had passed through it at all. Ethan straightened slowly. Ranger had already moved ahead, nose low, ears angled forward. He stopped beside a cluster of brush and sniffed once before stepping back. Ethan joined him and saw what the dog had found. Boot prints. 3 sets, different sizes, tactical soles. The stride was measured and deliberate, suggesting trained movement under load. Ethan felt a familiar tightening in his chest. Not fear, but recognition. He lifted his binoculars and scanned the tree where he had mounted one of his motion cameras the previous afternoon. The device was gone. He checked the second location farther along the trail. Gone. The third, covering the approach to the watershed, was also missing. They had not been damaged. They had been removed cleanly. Ranger let out a low growl, barely audible, his body shifting closer to Ethan's leg. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's neck, steadying. Both of them. He stood still for a long moment, listening. The forest was quiet, but it was no longer neutral. The silence carried weight. Ethan looked again at the impossible end of the tire tracks, then at the boot prints leading deeper into his land. Whoever had crossed his fence had known exactly where they were going. They had known what to remove, and they had done it without haste. He had come to the mountains to leave conflict behind. But as he watched Ranger pick up the scent and move forward without hesitation, Ethan understood a truth he had avoided since buying the land. Isolation did not guarantee peace. It only revealed what was willing to follow. Without speaking, Ethan adjusted his gloves and stepped into the trees beside his dog, following the trail that should not have existed, while the Bitterroot Mountains stood silent and unblinking around them. The boot prints led downhill, away from the cabin and deeper into the eastern section of Ethan's property, where the forest thickened and the ground sloped toward the watershed. The terrain changed subtly as they moved. Pines gave way to firs, taller and closer together, their trunks straight and pale like columns. Snow lay thinner here, broken by fallen needles and animal tracks, making it easier to read what had passed through. Ethan followed at a measured pace, careful not to destroy evidence. Ranger moved ahead in short arcs, nose close to the ground, then circling back to confirm direction before pressing on. There was no urgency in the dog's movement, only certainty. Whatever trail he was following was strong and recent. Ethan marked time in his head as they walked. 45 minutes since he'd left the gate. No wind shift, no new snowfall. The tracks were fresh, no more than 2 days old. He noticed how the boot prints kept a consistent spacing, suggesting men used to moving in formation even when they believed they were unobserved. This wasn't careless trespass. It was controlled movement through unfamiliar land, the kind that came from training rather than confidence alone. The forest opened into a narrow corridor between 2 granite outcroppings, the rock faces rising steep and dark on either side. Ethan slowed instinctively. Choke points like this had been drilled into him years ago, places where visibility narrowed and sound carried differently. Ranger paused as well, ears shifting, body still. Ethan scanned the rock edges and tree line before stepping through. Nothing moved. No birds took flight. The quiet felt intentional, as if the land itself were holding still. Beyond the rocks, the ground dropped into a shallow valley Ethan had never fully explored. It wasn't on any marked map, just a natural fold in the terrain where a year-round stream cut through dense vegetation. Willows grew thick along the water, their branches bare and tangled, and the snow near the banks was churned with hoofprints. Elk. Several animals had passed through recently, judging by the size and spacing. Ranger sniffed near a cluster of droppings and flicked his tail once, a sign of recognition rather than excitement. Ethan took in the scene slowly, cataloging details the way he always had. This valley made sense. It offered cover, water, and predictable animal movement. It was the kind of place experienced hunters would identify immediately, not casual hunters, but people who understood patterns and returns. That realization settled uneasily in his chest. 20 yards in, Ranger stopped again. His posture changed, head lifted, body angled slightly to the left. Ethan followed his line of sight and saw it, human footprints layered among the animal tracks. More than before. At least 6 distinct sets, varying in size and stride. Some moved toward the stream, others away. The traffic pattern suggested repeated use rather than a single incursion. Ethan crouched and examined the ground. The prints overlapped in places, compressed into the damp soil beneath the snow. They weren't wandering. They converged, dispersed, and returned. Whoever had been here wasn't passing through. They were working. He followed the trail toward the water and saw the structure before he fully registered what it was. A hunting blind, built low and tight against the natural curve of the terrain. Dead branches had been woven into a frame, reinforced with camouflage netting that had faded from military green to a dull brown. It wasn't large, but it was positioned perfectly, offering a clear view of the main watering area without exposing the occupant to open ground. Ranger approached cautiously, then stopped short and looked back at Ethan, waiting. Ethan nodded once. Inside the blind, the air smelled faintly metallic and stale. Ethan scanned the interior and felt his jaw tighten. Spent rifle casings lay clustered near the back corner, partially hidden under leaves. He picked one up carefully, turning it between his fingers. The casing was clean, the primer recently struck. He recognized the caliber immediately. High-powered, long-range ammunition. Expensive, purpose-built, not something bought casually at a local sporting goods store. He found more casings nearby, arranged in a loose arc that told a story of careful aim and controlled fire. Ethan visualized the shooter's position, the angle of the barrel, the likely trajectory. This had not been hurried. Whoever fired these shots had time, patience, and skill. Ranger sniffed near the front edge of the blind and let out a low sound that hovered between a whine and a growl. Ethan followed and saw the dark stain on the rocks near the stream. Blood. Not pooled, but scattered, smeared along stone and snow. There was too much of it for a clean kill. The pattern suggested movement, panic, and pain. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. He had seen enough of this. Kind of aftermath to know what it meant. Whatever had been shot here had suffered, and it had been large. He followed the blood trail downstream, moving carefully along the bank. The tracks changed as he went. Boot prints deepened, spaced closer together, as if weight was being shifted or dragged. 20 yards farther, the ground opened into a small clearing, and the evidence became impossible to ignore. The earth was torn up, gouged in long lines that ran toward the far side of the clearing. Drag marks. Something heavy had been pulled across the ground. Ethan walked the length of it and felt the familiar, unwelcome focus sharpen his thoughts. He followed the marks through a screen of brush and stopped. A road lay beyond. It wasn't wide, but it was clearly defined. The ground had been packed down over time, the snow thin and uneven from repeated traffic. Fallen branches had been arranged along the edges, not randomly but deliberately, to break the line of sight from above. From any distance, it would look like natural debris. Ethan knelt and studied the tire impressions pressed into a muddy patch where the road dipped. Multiple patterns overlapped. Different vehicles, different weights. Some were older, partially filled with ice. Others were fresh. This road had been used regularly, not once or twice, but over months. Ranger stood at the edge of the road, hackles slightly raised, ears forward. He was alert but not agitated, responding to the layered sense of oil, rubber, and human presence. Ethan straightened and followed the road on foot, keeping to the tree line. Half a mile in, the forest thinned again, opening into a space that made Ethan stop cold. A processing station had been built between 2 sturdy trees. Thick wooden beams supported pulleys and chains designed to hold large carcasses. The ground beneath was darkened with old blood, soaked deep into the soil despite recent snowfall. Plastic tarps lay folded nearby, weighed down with rocks. A crude table had been assembled from planks, its surface scarred and stained. The smell lingered despite the cold. Iron, decay, time. Ethan moved through the area slowly, documenting details in his mind. Butcher knives lay wrapped in cloth, their blades cleaned but worn. Industrial trash bags were stacked neatly to one side. This wasn't a temporary setup, it was infrastructure. Ranger sniffed at a small pile near the edge of the clearing and stepped back. Ethan followed and saw what the dog had found: discarded parts, antler tips, bear claws, a handful of teeth, some still set in fragments of jaw. They had been sorted, separated, stripped of anything that didn't carry value. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. This wasn't about food. This was trophy harvesting, selective, profitable. He stood there longer than he realized, the cold seeping through his boots, his mind working through implications. Whoever was running this operation knew the land intimately. They had identified high-value wildlife corridors, built concealed access routes, and invested in equipment and logistics that suggested serious backing. They had also removed his cameras without triggering alarms, which meant they knew where to look or had scouted recently. Ranger sat beside him, quiet, watchful. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's shoulder and felt the steady warmth beneath the fur. The decision forming in his mind was not dramatic. It was practical. This was no longer a question of trespass. It was organized, ongoing criminal activity on his land, and it had been happening long before he arrived. Ethan turned back toward the hidden road, already planning his return route. He would document what he could without being seen. He would map the access points, and then he would decide his next move. As they left the clearing, Ranger glanced back once, ears shifting, as if committing the place to memory. Ethan didn't need to look. He knew this valley would not let him walk away, unchanged. The forest closed behind them, quiet and indifferent, while the weight of what he had found settled in fully for the first time. Ethan didn't return to the cabin by the same route. The hidden road, the processing station, the blind by the stream, each location had altered his understanding of the land, and he refused to let habit guide him now. He looped north through denser timber, following a ridgeline that offered elevation and cover. Ranger stayed close, adjusting easily to Ethan's pace, occasionally lifting his head to test the wind before moving on. The dog's confidence remained steady, but Ethan noticed the increased frequency with which Ranger checked behind them. Not fear. Awareness. Something had shifted. By the time the cabin came into view, the light was thinning. Late afternoon in winter carried a quiet urgency, the sun already low, its pale glow filtered through cloud and branch. Ethan stopped short of the clearing and studied the structure from a distance. Nothing appeared disturbed, no tracks he hadn't made himself, no movement. Still, he waited, counting breaths, scanning windows, tree lines, the slope above the roof. Only when the silence felt unforced did he move forward. Inside, the cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and oil. Ethan set his pack down and removed his gloves, flexing his fingers to bring feeling back. Ranger shook off snow and settled near the door, positioning himself where he could see both the entrance and the main room. It wasn't a trained command, it was preference. Ethan poured water into a kettle and set it on the stove, then sat at the table with a map spread out before him. The topographic lines were familiar, but now they felt incomplete. He began marking locations in pencil: the valley, the blind, the road, the processing station. When he connected them, a pattern emerged that made his jaw tighten. The sites weren't random. They formed a loose arc that traced the most active wildlife corridors while remaining invisible from the main access road and his cabin. Whoever planned this had surveyed the land carefully, possibly before he ever owned it. That realization unsettled him more than the evidence itself. Ethan opened his laptop and accessed county property records, something he had not bothered with beyond his own purchase. The results came back slowly over a weak satellite connection, but the information was clear enough. 3 adjacent parcels, north, east, and southeast of his property, had changed ownership within the past 18 months. All 3 were purchased by the same limited liability company, High Ridge Land Management. The registered address led to a law office in Bozeman, no listed officers, no operating history beyond land acquisition. Ethan leaned back and stared at the ceiling, the kettle forgotten until it began to whistle. He shut it off and poured the water into a mug without adding anything to it. He drank it plain, letting the heat steady him. He had seen this before, though never on American soil. Controlled territory, layered access, legal distance between decision-makers, and consequences. The operation on his land wasn't opportunistic. It was deliberate. There was a knock at the door. Ranger was on his feet instantly, silent but rigid. Ethan didn't reach for a weapon. He moved to the window instead and looked out from the side, angling his view. A single figure stood near the edge of the clearing, hands visible, posture relaxed but cautious. Ethan recognized him. Thomas Reed waited with the patience of someone used to harsh weather and unanswered questions. He was in his late 50s, tall but slightly stooped from years on horseback and heavy labor. His beard was gray and uneven, trimmed short more out of practicality than care, and his face bore deep lines around the eyes and mouth that spoke of wind, sun, and long conversations with land that rarely answered back. He wore a heavy canvas jacket patched at the elbows, jeans tucked into worn boots, and a knit cap pulled low. Thomas had been the closest thing Ethan had to a neighbor. A rancher, whose cattle grazed miles downhill in summer and disappeared entirely in winter. Ethan opened the door. Cold air rushed in. "Afternoon," Thomas said. His voice was low and gravelly, not unfriendly, but cautious. His eyes flicked briefly to Ranger, then back to Ethan. "Hope I'm not intruding." "You're fine," Ethan replied. "What's going on?" Thomas shifted his weight. "Saw fresh tracks on the lower road, not yours." Ethan studied him for a moment before answering. Thomas Reed wasn't a man given to speculation. He spoke when he was certain of what he'd seen. That alone confirmed what Ethan already knew. "You want to come in?" Ethan asked. Thomas nodded once and stepped inside, removing his cap and holding it in his hands. Ranger approached, sniffed briefly, then sat back. Thomas noticed and gave a faint smile. "Good dog." "He is," Ethan said. They sat at the table, steam rising from their mugs. Thomas wrapped his hands around his cup and stared into it for a moment before speaking again. "I've been ranching here most of my life. This valley doesn't change much. When it does, it usually means trouble." Ethan didn't interrupt. "About a year back," Thomas continued, "I started seeing vehicles where they didn't belong. Late hours. No plates I recognized. At first I figured it was surveyors or hunters with more money than sense, but then I noticed fences getting cut on land that wasn't public, quietly, cleanly." He looked up at Ethan. "You bought this place not long after that." Ethan nodded. "I didn't know." "I figured," Thomas said. "You keep to yourself, fix your fence. Don't bother anyone. That's usually a good sign." Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Do you know who owned the surrounding parcels before the LLC?" Thomas exhaled. "A mix. Some old families. A couple folks who couldn't keep up with taxes. All sold quick. Cash offers. No questions asked." The silence stretched between them, filled only by the faint ticking of the stove cooling. "They came onto my land," Ethan said finally. "Not by accident." Thomas's eyes hardened. "I was afraid you'd say that." Ranger shifted at Ethan's feet, sensing the tension. Ethan rested a hand briefly on the dog's back. "I found a processing site," Ethan continued. "Hidden road, blind. They've been operating there a while." Thomas closed his eyes for a moment. When he opened them, something had settled in his expression, a mixture of anger and resignation. "Then it's worse than I thought." He stood and walked to the window, looking out across the clearing as if seeing something far beyond it. "A friend of mine," he said quietly, "used to work wildlife enforcement, retired now. He always said the worst poachers weren't desperate, they were organized, treated animals like inventory." Ethan joined him at the window. "That's what this is." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then you need to be careful. People like that don't scare easy." "I'm not looking for trouble," Ethan said, "but I won't ignore it." Thomas turned, studying Ethan more closely now. The stillness, the controlled posture, the absence of bravado. "You've done this kind of thing before," he said. It wasn't a question. Ethan didn't answer directly. "I'll document what I can. Then I'll decide who to call." "That's the right order," Thomas said. "And if you need eyes downhill, I can help. I don't move as fast as I used to, but I notice things." Ethan met his gaze and nodded. "I appreciate that." Thomas reached for his cap. "Just don't try to handle it alone. Mountains have long memories, but they don't take sides." After he left, the cabin felt smaller, the silence heavier. Ethan sat back at the table and looked again at the map, now marked with more certainty than he wanted. Ranger rested his chin on Chalsonia. Ethan's boot, steady and present. Ethan knew one thing clearly now. This wasn't just his problem, and it wouldn't stay contained much longer. Outside, the light faded completely, and the Bitterroot Valley settled into night, holding its secrets a little tighter. Ethan slept lightly that night, the kind of sleep that hovered just above consciousness. The cabin creaked as the temperature dropped, logs contracting with soft, irregular pops. Wind moved through the trees in long, steady currents, brushing snow from branches and carrying it across the roof in faint, rasping sweeps. Ranger lay near the bed, his body stretched but his head lifted, ears shifting at every unfamiliar sound. Neither of them truly rested. Too much had changed for that. Before dawn, Ethan was awake. He dressed without turning on the lights, relying on memory and the pale gray glow filtering through the window. Coffee heated on the stove while he pulled on boots and checked the weather station mounted outside the kitchen door. 12 degrees and falling, clear skies, no new snow, good conditions for visibility, bad conditions for mistakes. He took the binoculars and stepped onto the porch. From this elevation, the valley below was a muted shape, layered in shadow. The hidden road lay out of sight, but Ethan could feel its presence now, like a line drawn through the forest that refused to stay invisible. Ranger joined him, standing close, breath steaming softly. Ethan made a decision he had been circling since Thomas Reed left. He would not confront anyone directly, not yet. He needed to understand how the operation moved, who coordinated it, and when. That meant observing without being observed. By mid-morning, he and Ranger were moving again, this time toward the southern boundary of the property. Ethan followed a game trail that ran parallel to the hidden road but stayed higher on the slope, offering better sightlines. He stopped often, marking landmarks with small, discreet indicators only he would notice. Ranger ranged ahead, then returned, his movements controlled and quiet. They reached a ridge overlooking a narrow section of the concealed road just after noon. Ethan settled in behind a fallen log, positioning himself where branches broke, his outline. He adjusted the binoculars and waited. It took nearly an hour. The sound came first, a low, distant hum that didn't belong to wind or water. Ranger stiffened immediately. Ethan raised the binoculars as a dark vehicle emerged between trees below, moving slowly but confidently. No headlights, heavy-duty tires. A second vehicle followed, then a third, spaced evenly. They stopped near a bend in the road, engines idling. 4 men stepped out. Ethan studied them carefully. These weren't locals. Their clothing was expensive camouflage, clean but worn in deliberate places. Their boots were reinforced high quality, the kind built for long use. 2 carried rifles in soft cases. The others moved with the relaxed assurance of men who believed the land beneath their feet belonged to them. One man stood out. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, with a thick, trimmed beard the color of dark rust. His hair was pulled back into a short tie at the nape of his neck. He moved less than the others, observing rather than acting, his posture calm and commanding without effort. When he spoke, the others listened. Ethan couldn't hear the words, but the hierarchy was obvious. This man had been here before, often. Ethan noted the way the group split, 2 moving uphill with rifles, 2 staying with the vehicles. Their coordination was practiced, not military but adjacent to it. Contractors, perhaps, or guides with private security experience. Ranger let out a barely audible huff, not a growl, just a release of tension. Ethan placed 2 fingers lightly against the dog's shoulder, grounding him. The men were joined moments later by another figure approaching on foot from the east. This one moved differently, lighter steps, quicker pace. When he reached the group, Ethan saw why. The newcomer was younger, late 20s at most, lean, with close-cropped blonde hair and a narrow face marked by restless energy. He carried a tablet and gestured animatedly, as he spoke, pointing toward the valley. A coordinator, Ethan thought. Data-driven, probably the one managing animal movement, tracking collars or trail cams. The realization hit harder than he expected. This wasn't just about killing animals. It was about control, predicting behavior, engineering outcomes, selling certainty. Ethan watched as the bearded man nodded once, decisive, then clapped the younger man on the shoulder. Orders given. Roles confirmed. The group dispersed, moving deeper into the forest, leaving the vehicles behind. Ethan waited long after they disappeared. He didn't follow. Not yet. He had what he needed for now: confirmation, faces, patterns. On the way back toward the cabin, Ethan altered his route again, looping wide and keeping elevation. He noticed fresh cuts in undergrowth where equipment had been dragged recently. He photographed them with his phone, careful to keep metadata intact. Rangers stayed alert but calm, trusting Ethan's pacing. They were within a quarter-mile of the cabin when Ranger stopped abruptly. His head lifted, ears forward, body rigid. Ethan froze instantly, scanning ahead. Footsteps approached from the tree line. Ethan stepped back behind a stand of firs as a woman emerged into the clearing below, walking cautiously but not stealthily. She was alone. She wore a heavy down jacket in muted green, practical hiking pants, and boots dusted with snow. A knit cap covered most of her hair, but strands of dark brown escaped along her temples. She appeared to be in her early 40s, medium height, with a lean build shaped more by endurance than strength. Her face was angular, thoughtful, with sharp eyes that scanned the surroundings with professional focus rather than fear. She carried a small pack and held a GPS unit in one gloved hand. Ethan waited until she stopped near the edge of his property marker before stepping into view. She startled slightly, but recovered quickly, straightening and lowering her hands in a non-threatening gesture. "Didn't mean to trespass," she said. Her voice was calm, measured. "I thought this land was unoccupied." "It isn't," Ethan replied. He kept his tone neutral. Ranger remained at his side, alert but silent. The woman nodded once, taking in Ethan's stance, the dog, the terrain. "I can see that now." She introduced herself as Claire Whitman, a regional wildlife biologist contracted by the state to survey elk and predator movement. Her features softened slightly when she spoke about her work, but there was tension beneath it. Ethan noticed the faint lines at the corners of her eyes, the mark of someone used to long days outdoors and difficult conversations. "I've been tracking anomalies," she said. "Collars going offline, migration patterns shifting abruptly, animals disappearing in clusters rather than gradually." Ethan studied her closely. She didn't carry herself like someone looking for trouble, but like someone who had already found it and didn't like the answers. "You didn't come up here by accident," Ethan said. Claire hesitated, then shook her head. "No, I came because this area keeps showing up in the data and because no one local would give me straight answers." Ranger sniffed the air near her boots, then stepped back. Claire noticed and offered a small, respectful smile. "He's trained." "Yes," Ethan said simply. They stood there in the cold, the distance between them measured and deliberate. Ethan felt the weight of the decision forming again, how much to reveal, how soon. "I found evidence of organized poaching," he said finally. "It's active, and it's professional." Claire's jaw tightened. "Then I'm not imagining it," Ethan nodded. "No." They didn't say much more. They didn't need to. Understanding settled between them, heavy and unwelcome. Claire glanced back toward the forest, then at Ethan. "If you document what you can. Keep it secure. People involved in this don't like attention." "I know," Ethan said. She gave a short, humorless laugh. "That figures." When she left, retracing her steps carefully, Ethan watched until she disappeared into the trees. Ranger stayed focused long after. Back at the cabin, Ethan added another name to his mental list. Not an enemy, but not yet an ally. The web was expanding. What had started as intrusion had become exposure. He sat at the table again that evening, maps spread wide, notes more detailed now. The valley, the road, the men, the woman, lines drawn before him, closing in. And for the first time since buying the land, Ethan accepted a truth he could no longer avoid. He had been seen. The night settled in without ceremony, clear and brittle, the stars sharp enough to feel close. Ethan moved through the cabin with deliberate economy, turning off lights, checking shutters, setting the generator to stand by. He didn't prepare for a fight, he prepared for observation. The difference mattered. Ranger mirrored the shift, pacing once through the room before choosing a position near the back window where he could see the tree line and the slope below. The dog's breathing was steady, his posture loose but ready, the way it had been during deployments when nothing happened for hours and then everything happened at once. Ethan spread the map again and added what he had learned, the vehicle's timing, the hierarchy he'd observed, Claire Whitman's data-driven suspicions. He marked the bend in the hidden road where the convoy paused and the ridge he'd used to watch them. He wrote nothing down that could be traced if the cabin were searched. The notes lived in his head, layered and indexed. He had learned the hard way that paper was a liability. He stepped outside once more before turning in. The cold bit hard, the kind that stiffened joints and sharpened sound. He stood still and listened. Somewhere far down the valley an engine coughed once and died. It could have been a ranch truck. It could have been nothing. He waited until the quiet returned to baseline, then went back inside and lay down without undressing fully. Sleep came in short segments. He woke twice to wind and once to Ranger's head lifting, ears angling toward the east. Nothing followed. Near midnight, the weather shifted slightly. Clouds slid across the stars, muting the light. Ethan welcomed the cover. The first true disturbance arrived just after 2. Ranger rose without sound and moved to the door, his body stiffening. Ethan was awake before his feet touched the floor. He listened, counting the seconds between sounds. Snow compressed under weight, more than one set of steps. Controlled pace, no voices. Ethan slid to the side window and eased the curtain back a fraction. 2 shapes moved at the edge of the clearing, dark against darker trees. A third waited farther back, barely visible. They were close enough now that Ethan could see the outlines of packs and the dull reflection of metal. He felt a familiar narrowing of focus, the old discipline clicking into place. He didn't reach for his rifle. He stepped back, angled the porch light on, and opened the door. The sudden wash of yellow light froze the men where they stood. One raised a hand reflexively, palm out, as if to signal calm. They wore winter camouflage and face coverings pulled high. Their eyes tracked Ranger immediately. "Evening," Ethan said, his voice even. "You're on private property." The man nearest him lowered his hand. He was average height, compact build, eyes sharp above the fabric. "We're aware," he said. His accent was flat, unplaceable. "We're looking for a trail that crosses through here. Didn't realize anyone lived this high up." "That's not accurate," Ethan replied. "And you're not lost." The second man shifted his weight. Ethan clocked the movement and the bulge beneath the jacket. Not a rifle. Sidearms, likely. The third figure remained farther back, watching. "We don't want trouble," the first man said. "We'll be on our way." Ethan nodded once. "Good. Turn around and leave the way you came." There was a pause, just long enough to be a test. Ranger stepped forward half a pace, shoulders square, eyes locked. The dog didn't growl. He didn't need to. The man closest to Ethan glanced at Ranger, then back at Ethan, and something like calculation flickered across his gaze. "We'll go," he said finally. They did. The 3 figures backed away, slow and deliberate, until the darkness took them. Ethan watched until the sounds faded completely. He shut the door and leaned his forehead briefly against the wood, letting the adrenaline ebb without indulging it. They had wanted to see him, to measure him, to confirm what they suspected after spotting him on the ridge. He slept no more after that. At first light, Ethan packed a small kit and headed out, choosing a route that would put him above the hidden road again. Ranger moved with him, the stiffness in his gait more pronounced in the cold but never slowing him down. They reached the overlook by mid-morning and waited. The convoy arrived earlier than before. 3 vehicles, same spacing, same confidence. They stopped at the bend. The bearded man with rust-colored facial hair stepped out first. He scanned the tree line with unhurried authority, his posture loose, hands ungloved despite the cold. He wore a dark jacket cut for movement and carried no visible weapon. The others deferred to him without needing instruction. Another man joined him, new, older, with a thicker build and a face worn by years of weather and bad decisions. His beard was salt and pepper, fuller and less maintained, his eyes hooded and assessing. He moved with the assurance of someone who had learned to be dangerous without ever wearing a uniform. Ethan recognized the type immediately. Private security, freelance, the kind hired to make problems go away quietly. The younger coordinator arrived last, tablet in hand, his movements sharp and restless. He spoke quickly, pointing to the screen, then toward the forest. The bearded leader listened, nodded once, and turned his gaze, briefly, unmistakably, toward Ethan's ridge. Ethan did not move. The leader's eyes lingered a moment too long, then he smiled faintly and looked away. They know, Ethan thought. The group split as before, but this time with a difference. 2 men moved upslope, closer to Ethan's position than on previous days. Not directly toward him, just closer, a pressure, A reminder. Ethan withdrew without being seen, choosing distance over confrontation. He looped wide, photographing fresh tracks, documenting times, angles, and the new personnel. By early afternoon, he was back at the cabin, cataloging what he had gathered. A knock came mid-afternoon, firm but unhurried. Ethan opened the door to find Claire Whitman standing on the porch, snow dusting her boots, her expression tight with concern. She looked more tired than before, lines at her eyes deeper, her hair pulled back hastily under her cap. "I shouldn't be here," she said quietly, "but I didn't know who else to warn." Ethan stepped aside and let her in. She removed her gloves and rubbed her hands together, eyes flicking briefly to Ranger before settling on Ethan. "2 collars went offline overnight," she said. "Predators, both within a mile of your eastern boundary, and someone accessed one of our remote data relays. That's not something poachers usually do." "They came to my cabin," Ethan said. "Not directly, but close. Enough." Claire exhaled slowly. "Then this is escalating." She paced once, then stopped, shoulders squaring. "There's a federal task force that handles organized wildlife crimes. I've worked adjacent to them before. If I bring them in, it will get loud and dangerous." Ethan considered the map, the road, the men who had tested his boundary in the dark. "It already is." Claire met his gaze. "They won't move without solid evidence." "I'm collecting it," Ethan said, "but I won't provoke them." She nodded, relieved. "Good." They spoke for another hour, comparing observations, timelines, and gaps. Claire described the anomalies she'd tracked, migration curves flattening, sudden absences where data predicted presence. Ethan filled in what he'd seen on the ground. Together, the picture sharpened into something undeniable. When she left, the light was already fading again. Ethan stood on the porch with Ranger at his side, watching the forest swallow the path she took. He felt the boundaries of his quiet life narrowing, pressure building from all sides. The men on the road, the visit at night, the confirmation in daylight. This was no longer about protecting land from intrusion. It was about deciding how far he was willing to go to stop what was happening here. As darkness fell, Ethan closed the door and checked the locks, his movements calm, his mind settled into a grim clarity. The lines had been tested, the message delivered. The next move would not belong to him alone. Morning came slow and colorless, the sky a pale wash that promised cold without drama. Ethan woke with the settled clarity that followed a decision finally made. The night visit had drawn a boundary. The daylight convoy had confirmed intent. He would not escalate through confrontation. He would escalate through proof. Evidence, properly gathered, carried a weight that intimidation could not erase. He moved through the cabin with quiet efficiency, packing a small field kit that had not seen use in years. The items were unremarkable. Camera, spare batteries, gloves, a notebook sealed in plastic, but the order in which he placed them told a story of discipline returning to muscle memory. Ranger watched from the doorway, tail low and relaxed, eyes attentive. At 8 years old now, the dog carried himself with the calm confidence of experience. His coat had thickened for winter, the black along his back glossy even in low light, and the old notch in his ear caught frost like a thin, white line. When Ethan clipped on the harness, Ranger leaned in, ready. They left before the sun cleared the ridge, choosing a route that hugged the higher ground and stayed inside the forest's natural folds. Ethan avoided the blind and the processing station for now. Those sites were already compromised. Instead, he angled toward the eastern drainage where the terrain narrowed and movement was forced. It was a place machines struggled and men left traces even when they tried not to. By mid-morning, he found what he was looking for. A series of fresh cuts along saplings, clean and angled, made by a tool rather than weather. He photographed the cuts with a ruler for scale, then widened his sweep. Ranger worked a loose pattern, checking air and ground, returning often to Ethan's knee to confirm direction. The dog's behavior remained consistent, alert without agitation, an important signal in a landscape where false alarms wasted energy. Ethan followed a faint track that led off the hidden road toward a low rise. The snow was thinner here, the soil damp beneath. He knelt and examined a print left by a boot with a distinct heel pattern, different from the tactical soles he'd seen before. He photographed it, then placed a small marker a few yards away where it would not be noticed. Patterns mattered. Differences mattered more. Near noon he heard the sound of hooves. The horse emerged from the trees at a measured walk, bay coat darkened by sweat beneath a winter blanket. Its rider sat easily, reins loose, posture relaxed in the saddle. Ethan stepped into view deliberately, keeping his hands visible. Ranger sat at his side without command. The rider drew up and studied them both. He was a man in his early 60s, lean and weathered, with a narrow face and a gray mustache that drooped past the corners of his mouth. His eyes were pale blue and sharp, the kind that measured distances by instinct. He wore a felt hat pulled low and a wool coat patched at the shoulder. The horse, an older gelding with a white star on its forehead, stood patiently, ears flicking, accustomed to long days and quiet company. "Didn't expect to see anyone up here," the man said. His voice was calm, cautious. "You're on my land," Ethan replied evenly. The man nodded once. "Name's Walt Mercer. I ride fence for a couple of outfits down valley. I don't cut through private ground unless I've got reason." "What reason?" Ethan asked. Walt glanced toward the trees, then back. "Found a calf last week. Dead. No sign of predators. Clean work. That's not natural." He shifted in the saddle. "Been seeing trucks where trucks don't belong." Ethan studied him. Walt's posture held no aggression, only concern sharpened by experience. "You see anything else?" "People who don't wave," Walt said, "and men who look past you when they talk." He tipped his hat toward Ranger. "Good dog." Ranger's tail thumped once, against the snow. "I'm documenting," Ethan said. "If you see anything, plates, times, remember it." Walt nodded. "I will." He hesitated, then added, "This valley's changing. Best not face it alone." When Walt rode off, Ethan felt a small but significant shift. The circle of awareness was widening, not by rumor, but by observation. By early afternoon, clouds thickened and the light flattened, making edges harder to read. Ethan chose that moment to approach the lower stretch of the hidden road, staying inside the tree line. He photographed tire impressions, noting overlaps and fresh compression. He recorded the location of a portable fuel cache hidden beneath brush, new, carefully concealed, a sign of ongoing use. He did not touch it. As he worked, Ranger froze, head lifted, ears angled sharply. Ethan followed the dog's gaze and saw movement through the trees. One figure, moving fast, careless of noise. The man stumbled into a clearing and stopped short. When he saw Ethan, he was young, early 20s, thin to the point of gauntness, with dark hair that fell into his eyes. His jacket was too light for the cold, his gloves mismatched. He carried no weapon, only a small pack slung awkwardly across one shoulder. His breath came fast, his eyes darting. "Didn't mean—" he began, then faltered. "Easy," Ethan said. "You're on private land." The young man nodded rapidly. "I know, I'm just passing through." "That's not accurate," Ethan replied. The man swallowed. "I work maintenance, roads. They told me this was public." Ethan watched his face carefully. Fear, yes, but also relief at being confronted by one man rather than the group he likely served. "Who told you?" The man hesitated, then shook his head. "I can't say." Ethan didn't press. He pointed back toward the slope. "Leave the way you came. Don't come back." The young man nodded again, gratitude and shame crossing his features. He backed away, then turned and ran, slipping twice before disappearing into the trees. Ethan exhaled slowly. He had learned something important without forcing it. The operation used expendable labor. People who knew little were paid little, and would disappear quietly if things went wrong. He returned to the cabin at dusk and began organizing what he had gathered. He backed up photos to an encrypted drive, labeled times and locations, and sketched a clean map that showed access routes and choke points without revealing his observation positions. Ranger lay at his feet, chewing thoughtfully on a rawhide, the tension of the day easing from his shoulders. A call came just after dinner. Claire Whitman's voice carried fatigue and urgency. "I've spoken to a federal wildlife enforcement contact," she said. "Special Agent Sarah Morales. She's based in Helena. She won't move on suspicion alone." Ethan nodded, though she couldn't see it. "She shouldn't." "She wants a preliminary package," Claire continued. "Photos, locations, timestamps, enough to justify surveillance warrants." "I can provide that," Ethan said, "but not from my cabin." "Understood," Claire replied. She suggested a meeting, neutral ground. They agreed on a diner in Hamilton the following afternoon. Public, ordinary, safe. After the call, Ethan stood on the porch and looked out at the valley, now dark and quiet under clouded stars. The sense of being watched lingered, but it no longer felt paralyzing. It felt acknowledged. He had chosen a path that did not rely on intimidation or secrecy. It relied on accuracy. Inside, he packed the evidence into a plain backpack and set it by the door. Ranger rose and followed him, settling close. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the steady warmth there. He had not come to the mountains to become involved in anything like this. But evidence, once seen, demanded response. It weighed on a person until carried forward. Tomorrow he would place that weight where it belonged. Hamilton looked smaller in winter daylight, its main street flattened by gray sky and old snow pushed into tired banks along the curb. The diner sat where it always had, a low brick building with fogged windows and a hand-painted sign that promised hot coffee and no surprises. That was why Ethan chose it. Ordinary places made it harder for extraordinary things to hide. He parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest, Ranger at his side on a short lead. The dog drew looks, as German shepherds always did, too composed to be ignored, too intelligent to be mistaken for decoration. Ranger was 8 now, his muzzle just beginning to show a dusting of gray, his stride measured but strong. He wore a simple working harness, no patches, no labels. Ethan preferred it that way. Inside, the diner smelled of grease, coffee, and something sweet baking in the back. The booths were mostly full with locals, ranchers, retirees, a couple of highway workers in reflective jackets. No one paid Ethan more attention than a passing glance. That, too, was intentional. Claire Whitman sat in a corner booth, a mug cupped in both hands. She looked more rested than the last time he'd seen her, though the tension in her shoulders hadn't eased. She wore a wool coat the color of pine bark, her dark hair pulled back into a practical knot. When she saw Ethan, she nodded once and shifted to make room. Ranger lay down at Ethan's feet without prompting. "You bring it?" she asked quietly. Ethan slid into the booth and set the plain backpack beside him. "Everything I have." Claire glanced at the door, then back at him. "She'll be here." Special Agent Sarah Morales arrived 5 minutes later. She entered without hesitation, scanning the room once before spotting them. She was in her early 40s, medium height, with an athletic build that spoke of long hours rather than gym routines. Her hair was dark and cut short, tucked neatly behind her ears. She wore a charcoal coat over a plain sweater, jeans, and boots practical enough to blend in. Her face was angular, her expression focused, eyes sharp and observant. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to being listened to without asking. Morales slid into the booth opposite Ethan, acknowledging Claire with a nod. Her gaze dropped briefly to Ranger, assessing, then returned to Ethan. "Mr. Crowley," she said. Her voice was calm, professional, with a faint trace of the Southwest. "Thank you for agreeing to meet." "Agent Morales," Ethan replied. He didn't offer his hand. Neither did she. The mutual restraint set a tone. They ordered coffee. When it arrived, Morales waited until the waitress moved away before speaking again. "Claire tells me you've documented suspected organized poaching on your property. I'm here to determine whether that suspicion meets the threshold for federal involvement." Ethan nodded and unzipped the backpack. He didn't hand anything over. Immediately. He spoke first. "What's happening on my land isn't opportunistic," he said. "It's structured. They've built access routes, processing infrastructure, and they're using tracking data. They've tested my boundaries and attempted intimidation. I'm not asking for protection. I'm asking for scrutiny." Morales watched him closely as he spoke, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she said, "Show me." Ethan passed over a slim encrypted drive and his phone. Morales examined the images in silence, cuts in saplings, overlapping tire impressions, the fuel cache, timestamps, and coordinates. She paused at a photograph of the processing station, her jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "This isn't a one-off," she said quietly. "No," Ethan replied. "It's been operating for months, possibly longer." Morales leaned back slightly, fingers steepled. "If we proceed, we don't do it loudly. We don't confront. We observe. We build upon case that holds. She glanced at Claire. "You were right to bring this." Claire exhaled, relief and concern mingling. "What do you need?" "Access," Morales said. "Consent to limited surveillance on Mr. Crowley's property, camera placement, data relay. We'll also need to coordinate with state wildlife and possibly financial crimes." Ethan considered. "You'll be discreet." "We always are," Morales said. "Until we're not." They discussed logistics for nearly an hour, where equipment could be placed without alerting the operation, how signals would be transmitted, what Ethan should and should not do. Morales asked pointed questions about the men he'd seen, their vehicles, their routines. Ethan answered precisely, careful to separate observation from inference. At one point, Morales glanced down at Ranger, who had not moved since lying down. "He's disciplined," she noted. "He's trained," Ethan said. "Retired." Morales nodded. "So am I, some days." When the meeting ended, Morales stood and slipped on her coat. "I'll be in touch within 48 hours, she said. "If anything changes before then, you call this number." She slid a card across the table. Day or night? Outside, the cold felt sharper after the warmth of the diner. Claire lingered by her car. "This is the right call," she said, though her tone suggested she knew how dangerous it could become. "It's the necessary one," Ethan replied. Back on the mountain, the change was immediate. 2 nights later, Morales arrived with a small team, unmarked vehicles, no insignia. They moved with quiet efficiency, installing cameras no larger than a matchbox along the hidden road, the processing site, and 2 choke points Ethan had identified. The equipment was professional grade, encrypted, invisible unless you knew where to look. Morales worked alongside them, her movements precise. Up close, Ethan noticed faint scars along her knuckles and a slight stiffness in her left shoulder, old injuries, likely. She caught him looking and gave a faint, knowing smile. "Occupational hazards," she said. They finished before dawn and left as they came, without ceremony. The following days passed in a tense calm. Ethan went about his routines, checking fences, hauling wood, moving through the land as if nothing had changed. Ranger stayed close, alert to subtle shifts in sound and scent. The operation below continued, unaware of the new eyes watching it. On the 4th day, the first signal came through. Morales called just after sunset. "We've got movement," she said. "Multiple vehicles. And Mr. Crowley, there's something else." Ethan listened without interrupting. "They're not just hunting," Morales continued. "They're entertaining. We're seeing non-local vehicles, short stays, a lot of photography, trophy behavior." Ethan closed his eyes briefly. "Clients." "Yes," Morales said. "And money." The escalation came sooner than expected. That night, Ranger woke him with a low growl. Ethan was on his feet instantly, listening. Engines, close, too close. He moved to the window and saw headlights cut briefly, then go dark near the lower tree line. Footsteps approached, several sets this time, confident, unhurried. Ethan didn't reach for a weapon, he reached for his radio. "Agent Morales," he said quietly. "They're here." Her reply was immediate. "Hold position. Do not engage." Ethan stepped onto the porch light on, posture relaxed but unmistakably alert. Ranger stood at his side, shoulders squared. The bearded leader stepped into the light, face uncovered now. Up close, he was older than Ethan had thought, early 50s, his rust-colored beard neatly trimmed, his eyes cold and appraising. He smiled faintly. "Evening," the man said. "You've been busy." Ethan met his gaze. "You're trespassing." The man chuckled softly. "That's a matter of paperwork." Behind him, other figures shifted. One raised a camera, snapping a photo. Another scanned the cabin's exterior. "This is your warning," the leader said. "You live quietly, or you don't live here at all." Ranger took one step forward and stopped, his presence a clear line. Ethan's voice didn't change. "You're done here." The man studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "We'll see." They left without further incident, engines fading down the slope. Ethan didn't move until the quiet returned. Then he spoke into the radio again. "They've shown their hand." Morales' voice came back, steady and resolved. "And now we can move." As the night closed in around the cabin, Ethan understood that the quiet he'd sought was gone for good. But in its place was something solid, authority aligned with truth, and a path forward that didn't require him to become what he had left behind. The operation began before dawn, the hour when the mountains held their breath and sound traveled farther than it should. Snow had fallen lightly overnight, not enough to obscure tracks, just enough to soften the land and quiet movement. From his porch, Ethan watched the valley below dissolve into layers of gray as clouds slid low along the ridges. Ranger stood beside him, steady and alert, his breath rising in slow white plumes. At 8 years old, the dog moved more deliberately now, but his focus had not dulled. If anything, age had refined it. Ethan had been instructed to stay put, observe only, do not intervene. That instruction mattered more to him than he wanted to admit. The first vehicles arrived without lights, engines muffled, their silhouettes emerging where the hidden road curved through timber. They were unmarked federal trucks, indistinguishable from utility rigs unless you knew what to look for. They stopped well short of the processing site, and men and women stepped out quietly, each movement purposeful. They wore layered winter gear in muted tones, body armor concealed beneath parkas, weapons slung low and controlled. These were not loud operators. They were patient ones. Special Agent Sarah Morales moved among them, checking positions, issuing quiet instructions. Up close, her authority was understated but absolute. She carried herself with a calm certainty that came from years of watching plans hold or fail under pressure. Her face was set, eyes focused, jaw relaxed. She had done this before. That knowledge carried weight. Ethan watched through binoculars, tracking the spread of the teams as they moved into pre-planned arcs around the clearing. Ranger's ears followed motion even when Ethan couldn't see it, his body a barometer for shifts in the air. The dog did not growl. He did not pace. He waited. The first contact came at the processing station. The hunting convoy arrived on schedule, unaware of the perimeter that had already closed around them. Vehicles rolled in with practiced ease, stopping exactly where they always did. Men stepped out laughing quietly, breath fogging as they spoke. One of them raised a camera and gestured toward the trees, already imagining the story he would tell later. Another unloaded rifle cases, careful and casual, as if this were a sanctioned outing. They never saw the agents until it was over. Morales gave the signal, and the valley changed. Voices cut through the quiet, clear, controlled commands delivered from multiple directions. Federal agents, do not move. Hands where we can see them. The effect was immediate and absolute. Men froze mid-step. One dropped a case. Another raised his hands slowly, confusion giving way to fear as the scope of the response became clear. Ethan watched the bearded leader, the one who had come to his cabin, turn slowly, his expression hardening as he took in the situation. Up close, the man's confidence cracked. He was still, composed, but his eyes flicked, searching for options that no longer existed. Agents moved in, cuffing him with efficient restraint. Ranger shifted once, then settled again, sensing resolution rather than threat. The arrests unfolded with precision. Guides, clients, coordinators, each separated, searched, secured. The younger data coordinator Ethan had seen earlier stood pale and stunned, tablet confiscated, eyes darting as if the forest itself had betrayed him. Security personnel were disarmed without incident, their professional detachment faltering in the face of overwhelming authority. Within minutes, it was over. Ethan lowered the binoculars and let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The noise, voices, radios, engines, felt foreign in this place, intrusive but necessary. He reminded himself that quiet, when abused, had to be reclaimed. Morales called him just after sunrise. "It's done," she said. "You can come down if you want, but you don't." "Have to." Ethan looked at Ranger. The dog met his gaze, tail giving a slow, thoughtful wag. "I'll stay," Ethan replied. "This is enough." The investigation expanded quickly after that. Over the next weeks, federal teams cataloged evidence, dismantled infrastructure, and traced financial threads outward from the valley. The shell company, High Ridge Land Management, collapsed under scrutiny, its accounts frozen, its assets seized, names surfaced. Some were familiar to law enforcement, others would soon become public. Claire Whitman visited often during that period, her demeanor shifting from tension to something like cautious relief. The data she'd struggled to interpret finally made sense. Migration patterns stabilized, collars came back online. Absences became explanations rather than mysteries. One afternoon, she stood with Ethan near the stream where the blind had once been. Snowmelt ran clear now, unobstructed. "It will take time," she said, "but the land recovers faster than people expect." Ethan nodded. "It always has." Thomas Reed rode up a few days later, dismounted, and extended a weathered hand. "Valley's quieter," he said, "in a good way." Walt Mercer passed through again on his bay gelding, tipping his hat in approval. "Looks like you drew the right kind of attention." Ethan smiled faintly. "Wasn't my idea." Months passed. Spring came late but sure, pushing green through thawed ground, softening the sharp edges winter had carved. The hidden road was torn up and reclaimed, the processing station dismantled. The forest began the slow work of forgetting. The cabin changed, too, not in structure, but in purpose. With Morales' guidance and Claire's expertise, Ethan registered the land as a private wildlife sanctuary. Research cameras replaced surveillance ones, documenting recovery rather than intrusion. Students and biologists came occasionally, respectful and quiet, bringing questions instead of weapons. Ranger adapted easily to the new rhythm. He moved more slowly now, favored his injured side on long days, but his eyes stayed bright. He slept more in the sun, chased less, listened always. Ethan adjusted without thinking, shortening routes, pausing often. Care, he had learned, was another form of vigilance. One evening, months after the arrests, Ethan sat on the porch as the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the valley in amber and shadow. Elk moved at the tree line, unhurried. Birds settled. The world breathed. Ranger lay beside him, head on his paws, eyes half closed. Ethan rested a hand on the dog's broad back, feeling the steady rise and fall. He thought of the quiet he'd sought when he came here, how he'd believed it was something you could claim and defend alone. He understood now that quiet was a shared agreement between land and people, between protection and restraint, between knowing when to act and when to stand aside. The mountains did not. Thank him. They did not need to. They simply remained, holding what had been returned to them. Ethan stayed until the light was gone, listening to the night reclaim its place, and for the first time since arriving in the Bitterroot Valley, the silence felt earned. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with thunder or fire from the sky. Sometimes, they arrive quietly, through a man who refuses to look away, a loyal dog who stays by his side, and a choice to protect instead of destroy. The Bible reminds us that God often works in stillness, not noise, in the patience to do what is right when no one is watching, in the courage to stand firm without hatred, in the mercy that gives broken things a second chance. This mountain was healed not by force, but by faith, restraint, and truth. And that is how God still works in our everyday lives. In our own world, we may not face armed poachers or hidden roads, but we face moments where silence asks us to choose. Will we protect the vulnerable? Will we speak when something is wrong? Will we believe that even small acts of goodness matter? If this story touched your heart, take a moment to share it with someone who needs hope today. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We read every one. And if you believe no child, no animal, and no forgotten soul should ever face fear alone, please subscribe to the channel and join this growing community of kindness. May God bless you, protect your home, and guide your steps with quiet strength. And may you never underestimate the miracle of doing what is right, especially when no one is watching.